Donald Trump stood at the front of Unity Community Hall in Savannah, Georgia, his commanding presence filling the room. The usual bravado and sharp gestures were subdued tonight, replaced by a quiet resolve. Among the audience, a mix of families, retirees, and curious locals, sat 8-year-old Grace. Her small frame, clad in a delicate Sunday dress, seemed almost swallowed by the large folding chair. But what she lacked in size, she made up for in courage. Clutched tightly to her chest was an old, leather-bound prayer book, a cherished gift from her late grandfather. Its corners were worn, and its pages carried the faint scent of age and reverence. Grace's mother, Anna, leaned close and whispered, "If you're going to ask, make sure you mean it." Grace nodded, her heart pounding. For weeks, she had rehearsed this question, scribbling it in notebooks and whispering it to herself as she drifted to sleep. The atmosphere in the room was both electric and subdued. Trump spoke with his characteristic confidence, but tonight his tone was softer, more introspective. He spoke of policies and achievements, but the energy was lukewarm, claps and nods here and there, but nothing extraordinary. People listened, but they didn't lean in. Grace waited, her grip on the prayer book tightening with each passing moment. She was barely paying attention to Trump's words, her mind racing as she rehearsed her question once more. When the floor finally opened for questions, adults eagerly formed a line. Local issues and political concerns took center stage, leaving little room for anything personal or profound. Grace hesitated, shrinking into her seat. Her small hands clutched the book tighter, her heart hammering in her chest. Anna placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, giving her an encouraging nudge. Grace took a deep breath, stood on wobbly legs, and joined the line. Her shoes tapped lightly against the polished floor as she walked, the sound blending with the murmurs of the audience. The room began to shift as people noticed her. Whispers rippled through the crowd, curiosity mounting. The small girl with a prayer book stood out in stark contrast to the towering adults around her. "What's she doing up there?" someone whispered. When her turn came, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Trump looked down at her, his expression softening in a way rarely seen. His usual confidence gave way to something gentler, almost fatherly. "And what's your question, young lady?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically tender. Grace's hands trembled, and her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a depth far beyond her years. "Mr. Trump," she began, her words deliberate, "what is faith to you?" The hall fell silent. Chairs creaked as people leaned forward, and even the faint hum of the heating system seemed to fade. Grace's question was not one born from childish curiosity. It was profound, born from a yearning to understand something much larger than herself. Trump paused, his gaze locked on the young girl. For a man known for his quick responses, the hesitation was striking. He glanced at the prayer book clutched in her hands, his eyes softening further. "That's a big question," he said finally, his tone lower, steadier than usual. "And it's not one I've always had the answer to." The crowd sat in stunned silence as Trump's demeanor shifted. This wasn't the rehearsed rhetoric they were used to. It was something raw, something real. He leaned forward slightly. "When I was your age," he continued, "I had questions about God, too. My parents took me to church every Sunday. I'd sit there, staring at the stained glass windows, wondering if God was really listening." Grace's wide eyes remained fixed on him, her grip on the prayer book loosening ever so slightly. Around the room, adults who had come for political discourse found themselves drawn into something far more profound. Trump's voice softened further. "Faith, Grace," he said, "is like climbing a ladder. Sometimes it feels like you're going to fall. Sometimes you're scared. But you keep climbing, because there's something up there worth reaching for. The hall was completely still. Grace's question had unlocked a vulnerability in Trump that few had ever witnessed. And as he continued, sharing a deeply personal story about his late brother Robert, the weight of the moment became undeniable. "When I lost my brother," Trump said, his voice faltering slightly, "I felt like the ladder had broken beneath me. I was angry, confused, and lost. But over time, I realized something. Faith isn't about understanding everything. It's about trusting that there's a purpose, even when you can't see it." Grace's eyes shimmered, her grip on the prayer book firming as though it anchored her in that moment. Around her, adults sat spellbound, some dabbing at their eyes. "You're brave," Trump said, his voice soft but steady. "Braver than most adults I've met. Asking a question like that? It makes us all look inward. It reminds us of what really matters." What do you think about Grace's courage to ask such a powerful question? Have you ever asked yourself what faith truly means to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The room seemed frozen in time, the weight of Grace's question hanging in the air like an unspoken prayer. Donald Trump, known for his commanding presence and quick wit, stood uncharacteristically still. His fingers lightly tapped the edge of the podium as if searching for the right words. But the silence was not awkward. It was profound. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity replaced by an unexpected sense of vulnerability. Grace's small frame, barely visible behind the prayer book, had shifted the tone of the entire evening. Her question had pierced through the layers of political discourse, touching something raw and deeply human. Trump finally exhaled, his gaze softening as it returned to the young girl before him. "Faith," he began, his voice steady but subdued, "is not something I have always understood. For years I thought faith was about being strong, being certain, never doubting. But life has a way of humbling you." The audience remained silent, captivated by a side of Trump they had rarely seen. His usual bravado was absent, replaced by a quiet honesty that seemed to resonate with everyone in the room. "I want to tell you about my brother, Robert," Trump continued, his tone tinged with emotion. "He was my rock, my friend, and in many ways, my greatest teacher. But he struggled. He fought battles I couldn't see, battles I didn't fully understand until it was too late." The hall grew impossibly quieter, as if even the air had stopped moving. Grace's wide eyes remained fixed on Trump, her small hands trembling slightly as she gripped her prayer book. "When Robert passed," Trump said, his voice faltering slightly, "I felt like I had lost a part of myself. I was angry. At him, at the world, at God. I couldn't understand why someone so good, someone so kind, could be taken so soon." Grace's mother, Anna, placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, her own eyes glistening with tears. Around the room, others dabbed at their faces, the vulnerability in Trump's words stirring something deep within them. "I'll never forget the night after his funeral," Trump continued, his gaze distant as if he were seeing the memory unfold. "I was sitting alone, staring at a photograph of Robert, when I felt something. It wasn't a voice or a vision, but a feeling, like a gentle push. It said, 'Don't stop. You've got work to do.'" Trump's voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat. "In that moment, I realized something. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting that there's a purpose, even when you can't see it. It's about believing that the pain, the loss, the struggles, they're all part of something bigger." Grace's tears began to fall silently, sliding down her cheeks as she clutched the prayer book tighter. Trump noticed and took a step closer, his expression softening even more. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Trump smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a way that felt almost paternal. "That's a perfect name," he said, "because that's what faith is. Grace. It's unearned, undeserved, and yet it's always there, waiting for us to reach out and take it." The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through the hall as people exchanged glances. It wasn't just Grace who had been touched by Trump's words. It was everyone. Then Grace spoke again, her voice trembling but determined. "My grandpa used to say, faith is like planting seeds," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "You don't always see them grow, but you have to believe they will." Trump's expression softened further, a genuine warmth replacing his usual stoic demeanor. "Your grandfather was a wise man," he said, "and he was right. Faith is a seed. It grows in ways we can't always see, but it's always there, waiting to bloom." The hall erupted into quiet applause, but it wasn't the thunderous, obligatory clapping of a political rally. It was something deeper, more heartfelt. People wiped their eyes, their expressions a mix of sadness and hope. As the soft applause faded, the room seemed to hold its breath once again, suspended in the weight of the moment. Grace's small question had not only drawn out Trump's vulnerable side, but had also awakened something in everyone present. It was no longer just a town hall. It had become a gathering of hearts laid bare, each person quietly confronting their own beliefs, doubts, and hopes. Trump stepped back slightly, his hand resting on the edge of the podium as if steadying himself. His gaze swept the room, lingering on faces that now looked less like an audience and more like kindred spirits, bound together by an unspoken understanding. "You know," he began, his voice carrying a new depth, "Grace's words remind me of something my brother Robert once said. It was during one of his toughest times, when he felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He told me, 'Don, sometimes faith isn't a loud voice or a shining light. Sometimes it's just a whisper, telling you to keep going.'" The room was so quiet now that even the faintest shuffle of a chair sounded loud. Grace's mother, Anna, held her daughter close, her own tears glistening as she listened. Around them, other attendees sat transfixed, their eyes fixed on Trump as if afraid to miss a single word. Trump continued, his tone softer, almost reverent. "I didn't understand what he meant back then. I thought faith was about answers, about certainty. But Robert knew better. He understood that faith isn't always about understanding. It's about trust. Trust in something greater, something bigger than ourselves." Grace's tears had slowed, her face now a mixture of awe and quiet reflection. She clutched her grandfather's prayer book tightly, the weight of Trump's words settling into her young heart. Trump turned back to her, his gaze gentle yet firm. "Grace," he said, "your question tonight, it's not just about faith. It's about courage. The courage to ask what others are too afraid to. The courage to admit we don't have all the answers. And that's where real faith begins." The crowd seemed to lean in as one, as if drawn closer by the gravity of his words. Then, from the back of the room, a voice broke the silence. "Mr. Trump," a man called out, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He stood slowly, his rugged face lined with years of hard work. "I've struggled with faith for years. Hearing you talk about your brother, about your own doubts, it makes me wonder. Do you think faith is something we can lose forever? Or is it always there, waiting for us to find it again?" Trump paused, his eyes meeting the man's. That's a question I've asked myself many times, he admitted. There were moments after Robert's passing when I felt like faith had abandoned me. But what I've come to realize is that faith doesn't leave us. We leave it. And when we're ready, it's always there, waiting for us to come back. The man nodded, his expression softening as he sat back down. Around him, others murmured in agreement, their faces reflecting their own internal struggles. Grace, emboldened by Trump's response, raised her voice again. "Mr. Trump," she said, her words trembling but clear, "do you think God gets angry when we doubt him?" The room seemed to exhale collectively, the simplicity and sincerity of her question cutting through the tension. Trump smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "I don't think God gets angry," he said. "I think he understands. He knows we're human, that we question, that we struggle. And I think those moments of doubt are what make our faith stronger in the end. Because when we doubt, and we still choose to believe, that's when faith becomes real." Grace nodded, her small hands loosening their grip on the prayer book. For the first time that evening, a faint smile crossed her face. Trump straightened, his gaze sweeping the room once more. "Tonight isn't just about my story, or Grace's courage," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about all of us. Every person here has faced something, loss, doubt, fear. But we're still here, and that's faith. It's not perfect, it's not always pretty, but it's what keeps us going." The crowd erupted into applause, but it wasn't the kind of applause reserved for speeches or politics. It was genuine, heartfelt, and filled with the unspoken acknowledgement that they had all shared something profound. The applause slowly faded, leaving behind a profound silence that wrapped the room in an almost sacred stillness. Grace's question and Donald Trump's heartfelt answers had touched a nerve, not just in the attendees, but in Trump himself. The atmosphere was no longer that of a political town hall. It was a moment of shared vulnerability, a collective journey into the depths of what faith truly meant. Trump stepped back from the podium for a moment, his hands clasped in front of him as if grounding himself. His gaze returned to Grace, who now sat close to her mother, her grandfather's prayer book resting gently in her lap. Her question, so simple yet so profound, had changed the entire evening. "Grace," Trump began, his voice softer than before, "you've reminded me tonight of something I think we all need to hear. Faith isn't just personal, it's shared. It's in the questions we ask each other, the stories we tell, the moments we lean on one another." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "I've spent much of my life thinking faith was about being strong, about never showing weakness. But tonight, I've learned something different. Faith is about connection. It's about admitting we don't have all the answers, and trusting that, together, we'll find them." The crowd sat still, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, slowly, an older woman in the front row stood. Her silver hair was pulled neatly into a bun, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Trump," she began, "I lost my husband last year. We were married for 50 years. Since he passed, I've felt lost, like my faith went with him. Do you think it's possible to find it again, even after so much time?" Trump's gaze softened as he stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he said gently. 50 years is a lifetime of love, and I can't imagine the pain of losing that. But I do believe faith doesn't disappear. Sometimes it feels hidden, buried beneath our grief and pain. But it's always there, waiting for us to rediscover it. sometimes in the quietest of moments, sometimes in the people who remind us we're not alone. The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience as others dabbed at their own eyes. Trump turned back to Grace, his voice growing steadier. And that's what faith is, Grace. It's not something we lose forever. It's something we hold on to, even when it feels fragile, even when it feels like it's slipping away. Because faith isn't just about believing, it's about hope. And hope, my friends, is the one thing that can never be taken from us. Grace's lips trembled as she stood, holding her prayer book tightly. "Mr. Trump," she said, her voice small but unwavering, "do you think my grandpa is proud of me for asking tonight?" Trump's expression softened even further, and for a moment, the room felt as if it had shrunk to just the two of them. "Grace," he said, "I think your grandfather is more than proud. I think he's smiling down on you right now, knowing you've done something tonight that most people could only dream of. You've reminded all of us, myself included, that faith isn't about perfection. It's about courage." Grace wiped her tears, a small, shy smile crossing her face. The crowd erupted into applause again, this time louder, more sustained, as if releasing the emotion they had all been holding on to. But even as the applause filled the hall, Trump's expression remained thoughtful, almost contemplative. As the applause subsided, Trump stepped back to the podium, his tone shifting slightly. "You know," he said, "tonight, I thought I was here to answer questions, to share my views. But instead, Grace has taught me, and all of us, something far more valuable. She's shown us that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the hard questions and trusting that the answers will come." He paused, looking out at the audience, his voice growing firmer. "We live in a world that often feels divided, where it's easier to focus on what separates us than what brings us together. But tonight, this room, this moment, has reminded me of something important. Faith, hope, love, these are the things that unite us. These are the things that matter." The crowd nodded, some whispering softly to their neighbors, others wiping away tears. Trump's gaze returned to Grace one final time. "And Grace," he said, "thank you for reminding me of that. You've shown more courage tonight than many of us could ever hope to. Never forget the power of your voice. It can change the world." Grace's cheeks flushed as she nodded, her prayer book still clutched tightly in her hands. Her mother leaned down, whispering something into her ear that made her smile widen just a little more. Trump straightened, his tone shifting to address the entire room. "Tonight, I want to leave you with this. Faith isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up. It's about asking the hard questions, embracing the uncertainty, and trusting that we're never truly alone. So ask yourself, what does faith mean to you? And who in your life can you share that faith with? What about you? Have you ever experienced a moment that tested your faith or helped you rediscover it? Share your story in the comments below. Let's inspire each other." As the room erupted into one final heartfelt standing ovation, Trump stepped down from the podium. He walked over to Grace, kneeling slightly so they were at eye level. "Thank you," he said quietly, extending his hand. Grace shook it, her small hand dwarfed by his, her smile full of pride and hope. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice steady now, "for answering." Trump stood, turning to wave at the crowd one last time before exiting the hall. The people lingered, exchanging smiles, handshakes, and even hugs. The evening had been transformed from a simple town hall into something far more profound, a shared moment of faith, hope, and connection. As Grace and her mother prepared to leave, Grace clutched her grandfather's prayer book tightly. She looked up at her mother and said softly, "Grandpa would have loved this, wouldn't he?" Anna smiled, tears in her eyes. "He would have been so proud of you, Grace. So proud." And as they walked out into the cool Savannah night, the lingering warmth of the evening stayed with them, a reminder that sometimes the simplest questions can lead to the most extraordinary answers.